This picture is actually of a hummingbird close up, and it's been colorized. It's a black and white image. It's been colorized by a woman, an artist in Portland, Oregon, Fernanda D'Agostino. And we had a great deal of success with exhibits blending art and science in this manner. But that is a very close-up view of a hummingbird. On the right-hand side, you see its wing. You're looking right between its wings at its back. Its tail's down below and its head is up above. So we're close in on it there. What I'd like to, let's see, hopefully go back to this. My keyboard wasn't participating. Let's see, there we go. So this past summer, these are data or images of a calliope hummingbird male. This is a focal species for me here in Montana. There's so much in this that I really, in a way, almost wish I could just say, regard how phenomenal this is. This is taken at 2,000 frames per second. It's near Evero Hill, north of Missoula, a little bit west. And the exquisite control that this bird exhibits, as well as the feeling. I'm going to play this one more time just to, you can always look at this type of thing on YouTube, but it's remarkable to me, and I feel, again, very lucky to have the kind of funding that provide fancy cameras to get this kind of high-speed video. Look at the base of the wings and the body, and every time the wing stroke goes through what would we call a downstroke, you see feathers that react. And again, the exquisite how locked in its head is, and its body, it has this incredible control. And I'm not talking about it tonight, but that kind of control is exactly what I'm presently studying with engineers from Penn State University and the University of Vanderbilt. One of the things about hummingbirds that is amazing, and we can see it better than many people, is that not only are they adept at migration, but they migrate. And they're strange in the sense they migrate early. They show up in this cold climate in April, and they leave relatively early compared to many passerines and so forth. And on the right-hand side, we see a map from eBird and a concentration of frequencies of observance. And one of the things I wanted to point out about this calliope hummingbird distribution map, we're familiar with what's going on up here in Montana. That's great. We realize they show up and they migrate to and from us to somewhere. And I think Mexico and maybe Central America makes sense. But one of the things that surprised me, and it seems legitimate, people are carefully tracking these issues, is that these calliope hummingbirds show up in the east, Louisiana and Florida and so forth. And apparently these are legitimate sightings. So that's fairly unusual. But my main point behind this is that we recognize hummingbirds are exquisite at hovering. They rival any other vertebrate that exists, nectar-feeding fruit bats or other sunbirds that come close to this kind of performance, but none of them can sustain what a hummingbird does. And they have converged on the insect model, the body design, in terms of their capacities and their size. So one of the things I want to draw your attention to about them, and this, without making things too complicated, what's remarkable about what a hummingbird does is it's behaving when it's hovering very similar to a helicopter, in that it's pushing down air. And in this helicopter view Coast Guard picture above the sea, you see the effect of the wake blasting down, this induced velocity. That's what it's called, blasting down underneath the helicopter. And I'm just pointing this out, that the wake of a hummingbird is relatively similar to this. It beats its wings back and forth in a 90 to 130 degree arc for each wing, and it's blasting down 2 cores of air below it. And that acceleration of the air below it is what keeps the bird in the air. It accelerates the volume of air down, and the result is that it stays where it's at or does more amazing things like maneuver and accelerate upwards and so forth. So one of the things that is remarkable extends beyond hummingbirds to hawk moths, and for that matter to samaras, the seeds of maples. And all of these organisms have been separated by an enormous millions and millions of years of evolutionary time. So maybe 500 million years for these, and going back much further than that between plants and insects, arthropods. And this is a hawk moth. And hawk moths look strangely similar to hummingbirds. They've converged on the body style, and they've converged on the wing beat pattern. Or you could say conversely, both of these species have converged. They have flat, relatively long wings, And the wing, if you call it that, of a samara, the maple seed, for example, is relatively long and thin, and it's very flat. So convergent evolution is a remarkable case of testimony to a function. If you are small and you have a narrow, flat wing, and you move it in this fashion for a hawk moth, like we as humans do if we say treading water, a kind of figure 8 pattern back and forth, turning over the wing, doing what's called supinating it during the upstroke, or a samara, spinning in space. This is work from Ty Hedrick for the hawk moths, David Lentic for hummingbirds, and me and my collaborators for this hummingbird. But all of these three organisms demonstrate what's called a leading edge vortex. And if you use fancy machinery and lasers to illuminate the flow field around a hawk moth wing, you see this thing that looks a bit like a spinning event. Here it's visible in the hummingbird standing on top of the wing. Here it's visible in the samara, yet again standing on top of the wing. It's still hurricane season in the southeastern US on a very tiny scale. Notice this is 1 centimeter, roughly a little bit less than half of an inch. This hummingbird wing has this little patch of aerodynamic activity on top of it. It turns out to be extremely important for its functionality, for the capacity of this bird to hover. It prolongs the flight path of a seed. It helps hawk moths and hummingbirds hover. And one of the things about it is that it changes in a dynamic sense. So these numbers above this track, this is showing a hummingbird wing in different moments in time, successive frames of film, in this case, in the days before video. And what we're seeing in successive images here are positions of the wingtip and the wrist. But I'm just showing that this leading edge vortex, this LEV, is present on the wing, and it grows as the wing moves through the downstroke. Okay, and it's a dynamic event, but to make sense of it, you have to, and I'm going to assign everybody a small homework assignment and just say the next time you have tea or coffee or soup, something is visible, or if you walk down by the Flathead River or do something associated with water, you can demonstrate this kind of thing to yourself. And if you take a flat object like a butter knife and move it through coffee with cream in it, you can see the vortices come off. You can also see the way that it moves through the fluid. And air is just a less dense fluid. So if you keep even a butter knife or a ruler or a canoe paddle or a kayak paddle relatively flat compared to the air, and you sweep it through, or in water you sweep it through, you'll generate this kind of pattern of downwash that we associate with normal flight, like airplanes typically do. And that is a bunch of lift, a little bit of drag, an inevitable consequence of moving through fluid, and a down push towards the fluid. Now, take a canoe paddle, or for that matter, an airfoil, or anything else, and turn it sideways relative to the flow, and you see a pure drag event where you'll see vortices forming on either side and being shed off into the wake. And the paddle moves through space that's very close to 0 degrees. This is close to 90 degrees. And here's the point. The samara, the hawk moth wing, the hummingbird wing, they operate at a fairly high angle of attack compared to incoming air. So the wing is being swept through the air, or the samara is moving through the air, and it's meeting the air in a way that is pretty high, and it creates this leading edge vortex, somewhat like what occurs if it's a pure drag event on the side of the wing. So it creates a fair amount of lift, a fair amount of drag, and the net result of all this is that it increases force. There's an inevitable consequence of that force, that is a production of lots of drag. And so the animal needs to control for that. But Charlie Ellington, I showed this picture with the helicopter back in the late 1990s, 80s, excuse me, and through the 1990s, other labs were showing that this type of aerodynamics is absolutely essential for hovering flight in insects. And then me and my collaborators came along and showed that hummingbirds do it as well. It's since been shown to occur also in hovering fruit bats. It's very small bats that feed on nectar. So another aspect of this is a fairly complicated slide, but the whole point is that at the end of each stroke, half stroke, the wing flips over. We call it pronation when it starts downstroke, and we call it supination, like you could hold soup in the hand if you turned your hand over in the upstroke. And this is work from Michael Dickinson's lab. He's at California Institute of Technology. Fritz Lehmann was a postdoctoral fellow with Michael Dickinson. So again, this is a complicated slide, but what it's showing is that if you just move a wing back and forth in blue, that's just back and forth, you get a certain amount of force from it. And so the lift is in this idea of moving it back and forth, you get this much lift. It changes with each half stroke, and gray is down and white is upstroke. But if the animal rotates its wing as well as moves it back and forth, it creates what's called circulation, and it's a boost in lift production. And this shows the lift that's produced from just rotating the wing. And if I were there in person, I could do a nice job, take a flat plate and spin it around. But the way to think about this is if you've ever played ping pong or tennis, and you do like a cutting motion with the racket and you smack the ball with that, it's spinning. And what does that spin do to it? It drops the ball right over the opponent's net, ideally. That's negative lift. If you undercut with a paddle or a racket, a tennis ball or a ping pong ball, it'll cause it to boost upwards. And that's the same kind of lift because the ball itself is rotating, and that creates lift. That's sufficient to create lift. So the neat thing is that hummingbirds do this as well. We're looking at what's called a particle image velocimetry recording. So we seed the air. Let me outline. This is the bird's eye, and this is its head and its beak pointed at a feeder. And this is one wing, and this is the other wing. And this is illuminated by a laser, and it is a flow field where we take olive oil in a very fancy atomizer that makes micron-sized particles, and it sends it through the air so the room smells a bit like a pizza parlor. And this fog we illuminate with a laser. And the reason this black shadow is here is because the laser light is coming from above, and so the wing is blocking the light. We can't resolve flow here. And so what's happening is the bird has finished its upstroke, and it's doing what's called pronating, or spinning the wing along its long axis to start the downstroke, which will occur through here. So one of the neat things is you see these vectors, they're indicating air velocity. And then this term vorticity is spin, local spin in the air. And we see vorticity about the wing right here. It's just indicating that it is active during this wing turnaround phase. So one of the problems with any form of invertebrate, like insect or bird flying in hovering case, is that the wings start and stop repeatedly. Unlike a helicopter rotor, which humans, we've invented the wheel. Except for bacteria, there are no wheels in the natural kingdom. A couple of bacteria with flagella. So ignoring them, the advantage of a wheel is that force can be applied continuously to the environment. The problem with moving your wing back and forth is that in principle, you've got to stop producing force sometimes as you turn the wing over, turn it around. But hummingbirds have come up with a solution that's shared with insects yet again, and that is to maintain force production during the turnaround, to spin their wing along the long axis. So when they reach here, like we're looking down on a hummingbird, and this is the arc its wing is going through, when they reach here, they rotate the wing and produce lift in a phase that otherwise would be lost. And do the same thing at the turnaround between upstroke at the end of that and the beginning of downstroke. And this graph shows the result of that. We call it circulation. It's what's going on aerodynamically on the wing. And one of the features that's reasonable to take home from this is that downstroke and that turnaround produce more circulation, more force is what it amounts to, compared to the upstroke. So the upstroke is not quite symmetrical, but realize no other bird in a hovering or slow flight case does what a hummingbird does, produces force at all. But even the hummingbirds, there's a little bit of asymmetry between the two halves of the wing beat cycle. This is fabulous video that was involved in a project with several engineers. This is called this is a resolution of computational fluid dynamics. We're looking at the complicated aerodynamics modeled on computer system for what's going on as a hummingbird hovers. And this video will take you through a little more detail to show the leading edge vortex, the circulation that's based on the wing itself. And in blue and red, we're seeing pressure on the wings. as the wings are moving through the stroke cycle. So this image in red there, blue here, red again, and again now blue as the wing turns over for upstroke, shows cross sections of this leading edge circulation. What I'd like to turn to next is muscle activity. And one of the things, two things to really take home about the design of hummingbirds. They're extremely small, and their major two flight muscles, the pectoralis, which we have, which is the same kind of function in us. If you moved your arms, it would be doing the same kind of function, depressing the wing relative to the midline. And that's enormous. And then the birds have a supracoracoideus, a fancy term, which we don't have exactly. It's more like muscles on our back, but in the process of all bird evolution, that muscle to elevate the wing moved to the ventral keel. If you do eat meat, like chicken, and you buy chicken breasts or flip them over and see the chicken tenders, sometimes you can buy a separate pack of chicken tenders. There's a muscle that looks a little bit like a feather with fibers that run along a central white tendon. That's the supracoracoideus. Relatively speaking, it's smaller than the pectoralis. It's deep to it, so you'd have to take the pectoralis away and then see the supracoracoideus. But it's larger in hummingbirds proportionally to the pectoralis than any other species out there. It's maybe 1/3 or so of the mass, which indicates its important role in providing upstroke during hovering. So what I'd like to talk about is the hummingbird design, which they've pushed the vertebrate body plan to the smallest size possible, along with shrews. But they have to generate enormous power for their size. So enormous power per unit mass. And we're going to explore how they do that with these muscles with extremely high wing beat frequencies. So the calliope hummingbirds here in Montana have a wing beat frequency of about 50 times per second, 50 hertz. And all vertebrate muscle, including yours and mine, the central nervous system sends out neurons that activate fibers in the muscle, and they're associated with specific fibers that we call a motor unit. So to get force out, the nervous system sends an electrical signal down the neurons. If it wants more force from a given muscle, it'll activate more motor units and activate more of a cross-section of a given muscle. And this is a complicated figure, but the point behind it is pretty straightforward, and that is there's a lot going on deep in the muscle. So this is showing the neuron bringing in neurotransmitter, and there's electrical activity that occurs. And all the details here don't really concern us, but what I want to point out is it takes time for this to occur. Electricity goes very fast through organisms, through wires, whatever. But then there's the spread has to go to stuff that's internal in the cell, sarcoplasmic reticulum, that opens up and releases calcium and causes proteins to change shape, and all kinds of interesting but complicated molecule interaction and diffusion that takes time. That's the main point behind this figure. So the electricity excites it, and to get a contraction in muscle, you got to have these chemical events occurring, and proteins changing shape and pulling, and all that takes time. So hummingbirds beat their wings extremely fast, but insects beat their wings even faster. And two of the mechanisms going on with insects, one is called asynchronous flight muscles that permit things like honeybees and mosquitoes to have incredibly fast wing beat frequencies, is that the muscles themselves are oscillating almost like a rubber band and bending the thorax of the insect. So that's one mechanism for having very fast frequencies. And the muscles themselves are very different. So the asynchronous muscle, enormous fibers, they behave almost like tendon, and they have, in comparison to synchronous fibers in insects, that are smaller fibered, and there are more blood vessels through them, more of a blood supply. So what's going on? This is showing wing beat pattern, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in a beetle. And this is showing when the neurons are activated. Now you or I, picture your own biceps. You tell your biceps to contract, and hopefully it contracts. And that's a one-to-one event. Just like in this locust. One-to-one, wing beat, wing beat, wing beat, wing beat. And the neural system is activating it with electricity. Another event, another wing beat. But in the beetle, with this asynchronous pattern, you see an activation every once in a while. But the continuous pattern of beating of the wings. So it has a very high frequency, and it's like a rubber band, again, that's oscillating some kind of pendulum that has to periodically be reactivated. And that's part of the secret as to how these insects can develop such high frequencies. So we set about testing this in the hummingbird pectoralis muscle using electromyography, which is a very fine bipolar electrode we temporarily implant in the muscles through the skin, just poke them in there. And this type of work is done with humans. Typically with a human, you'd shave the skin and put on a patch electrode. People don't like being poked, but otherwise very similar. We had to put it in and put a small suture. This is looking down on the bird and showing it flapping its wings, and the little white dots are to help us track those wrist and wingtip points. And what we observed was stunning and very exciting to see. And again, thinking about the hummingbird pushing the vertebrate body plan to as small as it can go. So what's going on with this? Downstrokes are in gray. This is time on the x-axis. We're seeing the wing motion here. We're seeing a detail called chord angle. It's just spinning of the wing. Let's not worry too much about this particular row of data, but showing the wing twists back and forth along its long axis. Here's the electrical signal, the electromyographic signal from pectoralis and the supracoracoideus. Pectoralis is the downstroke muscle. Remember I said downstroke is in gray. Supracoracoideus is the upstroke muscle. And remember I said downstroke is in gray and the white is upstroke. So it's a mind bender. But what's going on in the hummingbird, because of time constraints, they have to activate and deactivate the muscle before the actual event occurs. It takes so long for the muscle to develop force and relax that their activation is exactly out of phase with what we see. And if you take your own arm, just picture pretending it's a wing, it's going up, but the pectoralis, which causes downstroke, is on and it's off. It develops force and it turns the wing around, out of phase with the wing motion we see in that fabulous video. We can see a wing moving back and forth. The muscles are out of phase with that because of time problems. There's not enough time for all those chemical events to occur, so it's been shifted to be out of phase. This shows another version of this where you compare a pigeon, which is down in B here, versus the hummingbird. And if you take a stroke cycle, a pigeon takes much longer for a wing beat than a hummingbird does. But if you take it as a percentage, where the downstroke starts at 0 and you're back to the next downstroke at 100, downstroke in gray, this is what a pigeon does. It's maybe a little easier. It decelerates the wing and it turns on the muscle to slow down the wing and start it up again for the downstroke. The upstroke muscle decelerates during downstroke, reaccelerates the wing for upstroke. In the case of the hummingbird, again, it's completely out of phase. So the pectoralis is occurring, its activation and deactivation occurs while the bird's moving its wing upward or backward if it's hovering. And then exactly the reverse for the upstroke muscle. When you compare the effect of flight speed on muscle activation, like how much muscle activity is required, we use a wind tunnel for this type of work. We've flown various birds, zebrafinch, parakeets or budgies, same thing, cockatiels, magpies. And the electromyographic signal shows you how much of the muscle is activated to accomplish the task. We see generally a U-shaped curve where it's pretty expensive and it takes a lot of muscle activity, a lot of work, a lot of power to hover. And then because of increasing drag, it gets expensive again to fly fast. And 10, 12 miles an hour is like 25 miles per hour, 10 to 20 meters per second, 25 miles per hour, roughly, which is maybe how we cruise around town in a vehicle. That's how fast these birds routinely fly when they're cruising. And in red is the hummingbird. And this is Rufus hummingbird that I studied when I was in Oregon at the University of Portland for a series of years earlier in my career. But it's showing the same U-shaped pattern. So that's not particularly unusual compared to other birds. For example, the cockatiel shows similar patterns of relative motor unit activity. But if you look at length change in that muscle, something very different occurs. So muscle strain is a fancy engineering term for relative length change. So if a muscle changes length by 50% or 0.5, that would represent it's shortening and lengthening over half of its actual length. And so expressing this as a percentage, you see that some birds up here, the hummingbird is shown with the arrow, is the smallest bird that's been measured. And some birds get up to say 35, 40% length change. That would be things like turkeys, pigeons, pheasants, relatively large species. And there's a general trend for the relative length change of the muscle to get less and less and less, down to about 11% in the hummingbird. And so what's going on with that, we can put into a context. If we now take body mass on this axis, log transform, just taking exponential values and putting on this axis, and then think about birds on the right, hummingbirds at the interface, and insects over here. And what is happening is going to take us towards the skeletal system. But hummingbirds are right at the interface. Now, we know that insects don't have internal bones. What they have is an exoskeleton. Their chitinous, what we see on an insect is this outer skeleton. And everything over here, including the hummingbird, has an endoskeleton, bones like we have. So what's happening in the evolutionary trajectory of the hummingbird, where this arrow points out, is that they've moved control and patterns of moving the wing relative to muscle motion. So transmission ratio is how much do you have to contract your major muscle compared to how far does the wingtip move. And we see that the ratio of that goes down. So these birds have to move their muscles quite a bit in order to a given amount of tip movement of the wing. And hummingbirds have converged on insects are moving towards that pattern with relatively small movement of the muscle creates an enormous sweep of the wingtip. So this is just evidence, further evidence that hummingbirds have evolutionarily converged on insects in terms of their form, their morphology, and their function. Another thing I'd like to turn towards, everybody here is excited about birds, and the upstroke of birds is highly variable. So before we even get back to talking about the hummingbird and the hawk moth for that matter, let's look at two very different kinds of upstrokes. These birds, these ducks have a upstroke that's called a wingtip reversal, where they raise their wrists, which would be right here, and they supinate or turn over their hand wing and they sweep it backwards. Pigeons do this, ospreys do it. Lots of birds with relatively pointed wings do it. This pileated woodpecker is showing a different kind of flexed wing upstroke, characteristic of many birds that have rounded wings like woodpeckers and passerines. Many warblers and finches and so forth have, sparrows. The corvids, they have this type of upstroke where they flex their wings pretty close to the body and bring them up and extend them over and start downstroke. So my point is that most birds leave their wings way out on downstroke and they sweep them. And on upstroke, they either bring them in close and bring that to start over again, like the woodpecker there, or they bring the wrists up and spin their wings over. And this occurs during slow flight, during takeoff and landing, for example, in ducks, called a tip reversal upstroke. Now, in contrast, I mentioned hummingbirds have a pattern that looks like we would use if we're treading water, where we're turning our hand over and generating a kind of imaginary figure 8 through space. Figure 8 with the tip of our hands. And I've already said, the hummingbird upstroke generates about 25% of force for the whole wing beat. The downstroke is more important. It generates about 75%. And this is a view illuminated by a laser where you see the wing itself and you get a sense of the distal wing being twisted over during upstroke, whereas there's a nice camber and a curvature to the wing during downstroke. And we see faintly in the background through here the olive oil particles that we use to illuminate the flow field. Now, going back to the 1930s, there were very serious German researchers prior to World War II who hypothesized that the hummingbird wing beat was functionally homologous, was similar to, evolutionarily, the wing beat of pigeons and ducks, that tip reversal, but just a more exaggerated version. And rather than belabor the point, I'm going to give you the take home early. And the truth is, that seems to be, or at least the data I've collected with my colleagues, seems to suggest they were indeed correct. And that is the hummingbird hovering is an extension, if you will, an evolutionary exaggeration of the tip reversal upstroke that we see in pigeons and ospreys and ducks in slow flight. So one of the major questions we wanted to explore is how does the skeleton permit that reversal? And the hummingbird skeleton is proportionally very different. This is a pigeon pattern. This is a hummingbird pattern scaled so that the hand wing elements are the same length. Of course, the hummingbird is tiny compared to the pigeon, but if you scale them to the same length of the hand, what we see is that a hummingbird has a very short, proportionally tiny humerus and forearm. So these elements have been reduced proportionally compared to those of the pigeon. And then it has a very pointed wing compared to birds that flex their wings completely like the zebrafinch. So a person named Bret Vasquez did a lot of careful anatomy studying not hummingbirds, but birds that use this tip reversal upstroke. And the question here is, how do they turn over their wings when they are flying slowly, or in the case of a hummingbird, hovering? And his hypothesis was that the reversal occurred at the wrist, and that it was relatively passive, that this locking mechanism right in the wrist would flip the wing over, and canals here would just cause the wing to swing backwards with it supinated or turned over without much in the way of muscle activity. And what I'm going to do is jump out to this view. I'm going to jump over here, make sure that I can screen share. Let me go to the supplemental material from a paper. Make this a little bit bigger. And just give you, this is a micro CT scan image that's been colorized. I'm going to click on it and just rotate the hummingbird skeleton around in space. And so a remarkably stout humerus and radius. We have a radius. If you spin your own hand around your wrist back and forth, the radius is the one that moves with your thumb. We have an ulna, that's the other bone in the forearm. Birds are unique. Hummingbirds and all other birds are unique in having a fused manus. So all of their finger bones have been reduced in number to a couple elements, presumably to reduce weight of the wing. At any rate, we can zoom in a little bit closer here and just get a feeling for how stout the humerus is. This is where the pectoralis attaches and tugs on the bone, and the supracoracoideus comes up through this hole and attaches on the back side of the humerus and pulls the wing in the opposite direction from the pectoralis. So fairly amazing. And I'll point out something else. This bone here, those are like our own kneecap. They're called sesamoid bones, and they improve the mechanical advantage of the muscles operating around the limbs. So this particular one is associated with the triceps. The triceps on the back side of the humerus and extend the wing. And it's a bone that's exactly like our kneecap or patella in terms of its functionality. Tendon encompasses this and moves around to help extend the wing. Okay, back to PowerPoint here. And let's see. PowerPoint, all right. And by the way, please interrupt me if you're not hearing or seeing anything. I'll make sure Zoom was sharing things properly there. I can go back to it at the end if you didn't have a chance to see that PowerPoint. So to study how do the hummingbirds accomplish wingtip reversal, or reversing the whole wing, we had a very elaborate setup at Harvard University with colleagues, multiple cameras, 7 of them, filming at or video recording at 1,000 times per second. And we put small markers on the hummingbird wing that were glued with super glue to the surface. So this is me holding the bird, kind of the wrangler, and a toothpick being used to apply these small radio opaque beads. And we have a view, X-ray view of the hummingbird body. It reminds me of a big M&M or egg. It's just incredibly round with an enormous muscle here. Here's the head. We'll see a little bit of video of that in a second. So this is live hummingbird video X-ray showing these points moving as the wings flap, showing the enormous pectoralis, and giving a feeling. Here's the gut through here, the bird's feet, there's its head. Notice how, I'm going to go back on these 2 videos to show them, because it's remarkable to have the honor, I would say, of being able to see this kind of thing for the first time in a live bird. Notice how still the head is, and the body rocks back and forth a little bit. In this dorsal ventral view, in this lateral view, here's the crop. The bird's drinking, and so that crop is expanding with nectar, sugar water as it feeds. This enormous pectoralis, and these are the beads that we're tracking in space, three-dimensional space with all of these cameras and the X-ray videography. So what we measured were kinematics. It's a fancy word for wing motions, but this just shows or verifies that the wing is pretty much all in a plane. It's a little bit curved or twisted, but not that much during downstroke. And then upstroke in white just shows that the wing twists over on its long axis. It spins over. And the distal wing in green is rotated even more than the proximal wing, which is in blue. The humerus itself is in blue. Proximal wing is in lighter blue. So as you move out, there's greater and greater twist as you move along the wing. This shows a view of that skeleton from the PDF, the animated version I was showing you. This gives a feel for what the wing looks like in upstroke and downstroke. Relatively hard to interpret. And a way to make sense of this for yourself is to extend your own arms out and just picture most birds that have their wings relatively extended. And when they rotate the wing, they're causing a change in angle of attack. And they sweep it by rotating back and forth the humerus. What's happened in the hummingbird line is that that group of birds has evolved very tiny radius. Everything is brought very close to the body. And what happens is most of the sweep occurs by rotating the humerus, and they turn their hand wing over. And most of what we see, which is evident from this picture, almost everything we see in a live hummingbird from outside the bird is actually the feathers, not the bones. The region of the wing is very close to the body where the bones are. And so it's swept back and forth by rotating the humerus, and then the bulk of the movement occurs by rotating or twisting the hand wing. And the Germans were correct in this regard, and that seems to be exactly what's going on in pigeons and ducks and ospreys and other birds that use tip reversal. It's just that it's exaggerated because of the morphology of the hummingbird. This shows the upstroke postures. Downstroke, if I toggle back and forth, we see patterns here that just show that especially the red bone, the humerus is rotating. So the final thing I'd like to mention is that flight requires an enormous amount of power. And hummingbirds, just like all of the birds, they're encased in feathers. They have a down jacket around them all the time. And one of the things I'm very excited about studying with a collaborator named Don Powers is how do these birds dissipate heat when they're flying vigorously in warm situations? There may be limits to the ability of some animal generating so much heat. So these are thermal images. This shows a hovering hummingbird and a hummingbird flying at about 6 meters a second or 12 miles an hour in the wind tunnel, and even faster at 12 meters per second, or again, about 25 miles an hour. These mountainscapes here indicate peak regions of heat dissipation. And we see right around the eye of the hummingbird, right at the wing pit, or where the shoulder is, and in the feet. And one of the things I'll draw your attention to is that the feet are retracted and don't serve during fast flight because they would generate too much drag if they were hanging out. So the bird is shifting how it dissipates heat as it flies at different speeds. But the axial region, the shoulder and the eye, remain very important across all speeds. The feet leave the picture as the animal is flying forward to reduce drag. These are videos also showing the reverse situation. Cold, notice how puffed up this bird is. So it's fluffing up its down coat to stay warm. It's still dissipating heat, but in warm conditions, notice how bright white, or excuse me, yellowish even, slightly white, the feet are. Let's play that again. Extended out like a radiator, dissipating heat. And we see, again, hot spots, heat dissipation areas right in the wingtip region and in the eye, as we do during the flight. Let's look at the hovering case again. Very different posture. This thing is puffed up like a cotton ball, keeping warm. 5 degrees Celsius, pretty cold for a hummingbird, emulating conditions when they arrive in mid-April in the evening before they go into torpor, presumably to live through another night. In these kind of conditions, 32 degrees C, this would be in the middle of July. So the birds are either going to go find shade to hide, or they're going to keep their feet out to help dissipate as they hover in these super warm situations. So to wrap this up, what I've shared with you are a variety of ways in which hummingbirds have converged on insects, and for that matter, samaras, which are the seeds of certain types of trees, plants, but they have leading edge vortices. Their flat wings generate those that generate rotational circulation, and they twist their wings to enable an up and down stroke that generates weight support. They modulate power via motor unit recruitment, but there's this incredible offset where the actual activation of their primary muscles is out of phase with the wing motion itself. They show low strain, so relatively short muscle contractions compared to other birds, and that's also very similar to what insects do. They leave their wings out when they fly it, even when they're hovering, when the other birds would flex their wings some, or in faster flight. They use their humerus to sweep or get the big angle through which the wing goes. But then their muscles are inserting very close to a very short humerus, and they twist their wings and they supinate. And so most of what you see when you're looking at a hummingbird through binoculars or with just your eyes or on a video, most of what you see of the wing is the twisting to flip the wing over at the wrist. And the final thing, which I just mentioned almost in passing, but flight is very expensive. Hummingbirds generate enormous power, and a lot of that power gets lost as heat. And so they have a real challenge to dissipate that heat. Now that's a great thing for keeping warm. You show up as an early migrant in April, it might still be snowing here in Montana, but all they have to do is fly to warm up. Just like all we would have to do is do jumping jacks or run to keep warm. It's a fair problem in warmer conditions in July, for example, or early August, in the middle of summer. And chances are the birds seek shade, so they behaviorally thermoregulate, but also they have heat dissipation areas, the eye, the wing pit or axial region, and the feet, which they use to keep cool. And I have a number of people to thank specifically for this research. Was funded by the National Science Foundation, and a number of my colleagues at various institutions. Don Powers has been a long-standing collaborator on virtually all of this work. Some undergraduates who contributed directly, some additional more recent collaborators, engineers on the last line from Purdue, from University of Virginia, from Vanderbilt University, and elsewhere. And I will, a special nod to Susan Wedlington. She's a hummingbird, very passionate about hummingbird conservation, and a bird bander and conservation promoter in Arizona. And she was of great assistance, but this is an example of somebody who, she does have a PhD, but her training took her more towards management and conservation, less towards research. But her contributions were really important for doing some of this work in Arizona. All right, and with that, I'm going to stop sharing and jump back to overall view here, and certainly open up for questions. Somebody in the chat said, please talk about migrations a little more. I mean, there's some amazing things about hummingbird. Carol asked that. Some amazing things going on, one of which is that hummingbirds, the ruby-throated hummingbird over in the eastern United States, North America, there's evidence that they will and are able to migrate over the Gulf of Mexico, which is an enormous distance. So they pack on brown fat, and they accomplish that probably with favorable winds. The majority of them, I think if I go back to slide sharing, I can just go to screen share here and whoops, stop share that for a minute. Let's go back to PowerPoint. Find where my PowerPoint here. Go back to an earlier figure, and this picture just of North America is good enough. You know, calliope hummingbirds, if they're going this far south, they're staying over land. But my point is that ruby-throated hummingbirds in the eastern portion of North America, some of them will migrate over the Gulf of Mexico. And it has been shown in more recent years that there's a preference for following the coastline for obvious reasons. if you fall into the water, that's it, right? There's pretty strong selective pressure against doing that. But the migratory capacity is still remarkable, and their ability to fly fast and forward is remarkable. And again, what is very interesting is evident here in Montana that hummingbirds are some of the earliest migrants, and they're some of the earliest to depart. And especially when you look outside at a feeder, or there's no flowers yet, at a feeder, and they arrive here as early migrants, and it's snowing. And they look very unhappy. It's presumably males, primarily males, trying to arrive earlier to establish territories to attract females. And it's important to bear in mind, a surprising thing is that they're feeding on insects primarily during this phase. The flowers aren't out yet. And so even with this pointed, very narrow needle-like beak compared to swifts, you can look at a swift and think, of course, swifts are capable of catching insects. They have these enormous beaks, and they grab them as they kind of mow through the air like a net. Whereas hummingbirds have this tiny needle-like beak, but they are quite adept at catching insects, and that's a primary thing they feed on when they show up during early migration. Let's see, intrigued by the similarity of hawkmoth and hummer size, I get the impression that hummingbird size is the maximum size that can rotate like it does at the wrist. And so would it be possible for a larger bird to have these mechanics? And that's a great question. One of the things I point out about that is that there are giant hummingbirds, right? So the size distribution of hummingbirds is strange. And in thinking of grams, you go from the calipes in North America, they're the smallest hummingbird in North America, 2.3, 2.4 grams. And then there are bee hummingbirds in the Caribbean and in Central America that get a little bit smaller, smallest in the world. There's a bulk of hummingbird distribution that gets to the 11, 12 gram range. Most of them are smaller, but there are a variety of species that show up in Ecuador and in South America and Central America that are on up into Arizona. In the Chiricahua Mountains, there's an extension where you see now are called Riveles hummingbirds and blue-chinned hummingbirds. They're about 7 or 8 grams. And then there's this bizarre gap, and then you have giant hummingbirds, Patagonia gigas. That is a, let me just try going to screen share mode here, if this will do it, and see if I get out of that and go to, just pull up the internet quickly and just get a picture of a giant hummingbird. These birds have not been, some of their wing motions have been studied, but they're apparently, I've never seen one in real life personally, and they are apparently the size of, relatively speaking, a small parakeet. So they're pretty remarkable, 20 grams, 10 times larger in mass than the calliope hummingbirds I've been sharing with you, and yet they do reverse their wing as the smaller birds do. Now, to go back to the question that was posed, I would tend to agree that the ability to rotate the wing fully like that is potentially constrained by body size. And so, but it's an open-ended question as to why evolutionarily hummingbirds are the only ones that hover indefinitely. Just as an anecdote, the record for me, well, it's a record for the hummingbird that I was working with, is a rufous hummingbird. We brought it into the lab, we put it in the wind tunnel, we gave it plenty of food and a feeder, and the bird wants to explore it, so it'll move around the flight chamber, checking every nook and cranny, especially on the ceiling, trying for a way out. And it was a female, and she flew for an hour and a half without stopping. It was like 40 wing beats per second for an hour and a half is an untold number of wing beats. And 1,000 beats a second, excuse me, a minute for the heart, not a second, that would be crazy, but 1,000 beats per minute, which is over an hour and a half. So as long as they have access to food, they can do what no other bird can do. And sometimes people will ask, well, I've seen kestrels and osprey and kingfishers hover. None of those birds can do it in still air. What they absolutely require is air coming at them. So a kestrel hovering, looking for mice or voles down below it, it's got air coming at it. It has to have that. And that air coming at it helps it to produce lift. Without it, in still air, it would drop out like a rock, essentially. They can't generate lift like a hummingbird can. And the nearest relatives to hummingbirds are the swifts. And they're so committed to forward flight that some of the swifts can't even hover at all. And in fact, a colleague of mine, Doug Warwick, and his wife, Wendy, when Doug was a PhD student, they were releasing swifts and swallows from the hand and looking at how well they could accelerate forward. And some of the swifts, Wendy was scared by because she had them and Doug was doing the videotaping, and she let the swift go and it just dropped to the ground. From a standing start, it could not get going. They're exquisite at flying fast, but in terms of hovering, they've got to get a launch. So the way those swifts would get into the air is to drop off a cliff face or a tree and develop speed before they fly forward. I'm happy to take further questions from anybody. From chat, if you don't want to talk exactly, or just jump in and be bold on the unmute yourself.
So Bret, this is Corey.
Yeah.
Quick question for you, just talking about the swifts and capturing them. I've held hummingbirds in my hand, and when they're on their back,
Mm-hmm.
and they won't, immediately take off. You can open your hand and they'll sit there on their back.
Uh-huh.
That because they can't lift themselves because their wings are pinned behind them? So they need to be kind of
that's a neat question that I can't definitively answer. But it's odd that in general, birds, when they're turned on their back, tend to calm down. So even passerines or pigeons or what have you, they tend to relax in a strange way when they're on their backs. So at least my sense would be that would be a component of it. And then the other part, you think you've got a point. They're probably sitting there with their wings on, they're on their back, but their wings are out. And they may not have the coordination to the necessary sort of wherewithal to flip and start their wings in motion. But they're remarkably adept from a standing start. I didn't share this with you tonight, but in general, as in all the birds have been studied thus far, except for hummingbirds, when they take off, the bulk of their initial speed is due to their legs. And that seems to be a mechanism to protect their wings from beating against the ground. And so what would happen is, and I could, if people are interested in this, I could dig through my external hard drive and find a video, but I can basically show it with my arms. What happens is that a bird taking off, a bird, like a pigeon, will be pushing with its legs, and then it starts to elevate its wings, and it's starting downstroke, and it's about this far through downstroke when its toes leave the ground. So again, it's pushing and pushing and pushing, and the wings are up, and it keeps pushing, the wings are starting to go down, and its toes leave the ground. So most of the initial speed is due to that push, like a frog jumping for that matter, because the downstroke hasn't even really started to produce much force. And in hummingbirds, it's more like about half. The birds are there on the perch and they get their wings going and then they get into the air. So the wings are much more important, and possibly when it's on its back like that, it just can't get them spun up like you're suggesting. I think that's certainly a valid explanation as well.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions for Bret?
I was wanting to know whether, this is Jack Kirkley, wanting to know whether any of the ecological equivalents to hummingbirds elsewhere in the world, obviously they don't have hummingbirds that are true hummingbirds, but do they show any of these sort of convergent traits to a hummingbird that allow them to be good hoverers when they are using nectar?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's a fascinating question, and it kind of, what I'm going to do is I'll go back to my screen, see if I can't pull up a picture of a sunbird at least. So this is one that I've seen in Africa, sunbirds, and in pretty broad distribution, but at first glance, these sunbirds, which are passerines, seem shockingly similar to hummingbirds in overall body form. They are small in size, and so to answer your question directly, I think one of the most important things about them is their small size. That's really what they've converged upon. And their wing beat style, the mechanics of it, the aerodynamics, has not been well studied, but in general, you can observe from videos that they're beating their wings much like a zebrafinch or a warbler, a yellow warbler or something would do it. In other words, they're tossing their wings out fully, extending them on downstroke, and bringing their wings very close to the body on the upstroke, and then repeating that pattern. So very much a passer and wing beat style, but in a bird that at first glance could be mistaken for a hummingbird due to its small size and long skinny beak. So I think the convergence is principally in terms of size and beak form. And interestingly enough, you could call it a phylogenetic inertia, that they've inherited the passer and wing beat style, and they still use that wing beat style. And they don't hover for as long a duration as hummingbirds do. They can't. They can briefly hover, but much of their mechanism is potentially to flit about and hover near flowers, then land and sidle over, and stick their beaks in the floral elements themselves.
All right. Well, thanks, Bret. There was, maybe just end with, there was one last question here, and this will be the last one we'll have for tonight. What future research
Sure.
are you looking at?
Yeah, well, I'm very excited. I only showed you a tiny snippet of the thermal regulation issue, and I do think that's exciting, and I'm about going in that direction, just understanding how thermal balance plays a role in how flight plays into the ecology and evolution with thermal balance. Another area that I'm exploring, excited about the hummingbirds, is an extension of stuff I've done before, but we're going much further in terms of the details of aerodynamics and control, and that is the escape maneuvers that hummingbirds use. And when they are hovering and they get startled, they have a very characteristic way of flipping backwards and rolling and flying away. And we're trying to tease apart how visual, it's already seems like they're primarily visual and not so much auditory. But just to give you a hint on this, for example, we've got an elaborate system of LED lights that we can turn off close to instantly and turn back on again. And the hummingbird will tip up and roll and then point itself down and fly away. And at different phases of that event, we can turn off the lights, and we make it as dark as possible in my lab, cover up all the windows with dark cloth from Joann's Fabrics and so forth. So let's say they're in near perfect darkness, and yet we have infrared lights that are illuminating what they do, and they're incredibly adept. They stop within about 1/10 of a second, so they're moving along and they stop. What they do is they tip up and they just hover in place. And they don't have any visual cues. They have gravity, and they're eminently capable with only a small amount of drift, very slow drift, of holding position in the dark. And then the lights come back on and boom, they get back to where they wanted to go and head off in another roughly. So their time between visual cue and adjustment is about 100 milliseconds or 1/10 of a second. They're doing what they're doing, the lights go off, it takes them about 1/10 of a second to stop, and they just hover in place pretty darn well. Lights come back on, and 1/10 of a second later they go. So we're working to further understand the aerodynamics of that and the control system, the neural side. And this work is directly with engineers who are trying to develop flying robots that emulate flapping winged animals.
Wow. All right. Exciting stuff. Hey, thanks so much, Bret, for joining
My
us
pleasure.
today. That was a lot of fun. Gail, any last minute announcements or anything?
No, as we mentioned, the next presentation will be Dave on something very mysterious, aliens.
Aliens.
And Bret, that was fantastic, the way you could zip from around your computer and pull up different things.
Okay.
I have lots of practice, I can tell, but I'm so glad you were able to just jump in and help us out with the Zoom meeting. So fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Bret.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, and do come up and visit whenever you can next year, if we ever have in-person meetings or one of our field trips.
Okay, and likewise, I can extend an invitation if you're coming through Missoula and you'd like to visit the field station.
Oh, yeah.
Contact me. I'm easy to find on the web. And of course, we don't have hummingbirds except for just a couple of weeks in the middle of summer, but there's other birds around, and I could show you some of these techniques.